personal views and opinions expressed by our podcast guests are their own and are not legal advice or official statements by their organizations. Hello, my name is Debbie Reynolds. This is the Data Diva Talks Privacy podcast, where we discuss data privacy issues with industry leaders around the world with information that businesses need to know now. Today I have a special guest on the show, Shoshana Rosenberg. She is a longtime attorney, a privacy advocate, and also the CEO and founder of SafePorter. Hello, Shoshana.
Hi, Debbie. So good to see you and speak to you again.
So we met on LinkedIn. I think we comment on each other's posts and stuff like that. You had reached out to me and we were chatting, and we decided at this year that we're going to do some type of collaboration, which we still will do. But I thought it would be fun for us to do this podcast together. So I saw that you had done another podcast with Pedro Pavone. I think we had both done it for him, and he had like an email out, and I saw your name. I said, "Oh, let me take this opportunity to chat with Shoshana and find out what she's up to." So I'm glad that you agreed to do this podcast.
Oh, I'm honored to be here. I'm so glad that you're putting out the information that you do. You keep it very, very straightforward, and everyone in the industry is always glad to listen in. So I hope I can add value, but you always do.
Oh, that's so sweet. Yeah, I love what you're doing. You do something very unique. So your focus, and I would love for you to tell your backstory as well, but I want to make sure people understood your focus is in kind of diversity and inclusion and data around that. So I don't know anyone who does exactly what you do. So tell me, a bit about your privacy journey, SafePorter, and kind of the privacy issues that come up with diversity and inclusion data.
Sure, I'd love to. So for 4 years now, SafePorter has been the privacy by design solution for diversity data intake and inclusion feedback tracking. And what's really important there is that the sort of the backstory of it is simple enough. I've been in privacy for about 14 years, international privacy law. And there was a point several years ago where it became very clear that organizations around the world, and as you might imagine in Europe, were trying to ask their staff or their members or their students about very sensitive categories of personal data that do relate to diversity and help an organization understand the representation, but that actually put individuals and frankly, the organization itself at a much higher level of data risk and privacy risk for the individuals, which was my focus. So SafePorter is a suite of tools that addresses that and ensures that identity doesn't factor in to where that is stored, so that the information is stored without the context of your school information or your bank information if you're applying for a loan and they're asking these questions, your job application, or actually your employment information. It's in isolation from that. It's not tied to anyone's name or email. And we have a patent pending process that ensures both that is handled properly and that the disassociation is finite, and also that we have privacy controls that ensure that recency or scarcity don't become identifiable unto themselves. So you're not going to see percentages change where you've just hired someone. So we've worked very hard with some brilliant privacy engineers to check and double check how we're going about things, and so that we can help our clients see who is at their organization and critically get the inclusion feedback that they need to in a truly anonymized and anonymous fashion.
Wow, that's interesting. So let's break this down a bit. I know a little bit about this because
I know you do.
because I work with organizations that create apps for students, right? Students, college, kids that are younger than that. And some of these app makers want to know kind of the race or nationality of users, right? So that information in the US, some places they want to have people volunteer that. The school may want to know that for different reasons and stuff like that. But you and I know that some of these categories or information around certain privacy regulations around the world may be considered sensitive data, right? If it's combined with other things. So I think that's something that a lot of people don't really think about, because they think, okay, so how harmful can this information be if it's combined? But we're seeing that be addressed, internationally, where it's being considered, in some places, sensitive data.
Well, and the other thing is that, frankly, where you're actually trying to understand the true diversity of your organization, which doesn't just mean do you have token numbers of something, right? But do you have a balance? Do you have a full spectrum of a universe of different types and, from abilities and types? And we're talking neurodiversity, we're talking all sorts of components that you want to be able to understand who you are as an organization and grow. And what happens there is that you want to ask questions that, quite frankly, most of us would not like the information to reside with you as the employer or the school, right? And most of us, we wouldn't necessarily want it next to our names or our emails, because this is something that we can give over to facilitate representation. But it doesn't mean that I wish for you to be able to tie it back to me. Yes, you should know that there's an Irish Jewish comic book collector, that's me, over 40, right? Yes, you should know that you have this person, somewhere in the mix. But it shouldn't be something that you can tie back to me. And so that's the notion. There are questions around sexuality, gender identity, right? That we want to be able to understand as organizations. Do we have representation? Are these different groups and different backgrounds, are people happy here? And do they feel that they have other people at this organization that they can relate to, right? These are questions we want to ask. But the data, having that data alongside any contextual information, creates a really unreasonable risk. It's a risk for bias. It's a risk for some sort of differential treatment that maybe is meant to be the opposite of bias, right? But it ends up with becoming something that can prove not only a privacy liability, but can prove an interference where it was just intended to allow for the company to try to get better from a diversity and representation standpoint. And the reason that I always harken back, and this, is that to the inclusion aspect, is that our tools are bundled in that the inclusion feedback component, which not all companies, not all of our clients are ready to turn on, right? There's a high level of accountability there. You don't always really want to see what's going on unless you're just at the beginning of your journey or you're very advanced. But it's important to remember that without that, the diversity is just a number. And if you've got a lot of unhappy people who are going to leave you in a year, and you're not trying to figure out whether or not they feel included, then you have that problem. So both of those things being separate from the data about the individual's context are really critical. So when you're talking about what they're doing with apps and things like that, it really is crucial to look at ways to not keep it all together.
Now, I think you may have a dual challenge in your role. So one, as a privacy advocate, some organizations, they've been traditionally reactive to things. So they may think, okay, nothing's happened, everything's, the trains are running on time, why do I need privacy? And then, you talk with them about diversity, inclusion, and privacy of that data, and they may not even know how that relates. So tell me how you tell that story to organizations if they don't understand, first of all, the importance of privacy and how privacy impacts kind of diversity and inclusion.
So thank you. That's actually a really, really critical question. The reason that SafePorter is a B Corp, we're B Corp pending. We're in the final. It was slowed down by COVID, but we're in the final confirmation stage right now. But the reason that we set out to be a B Corp is that I view it as a utility. And you don't generally call people up and say, "Do you need electricity?" Because when they figure out that they need it, they go looking for you. And I don't want to be part of an organization that is slapping the name of the organization all over the place and trying to pull people towards something and explain to them why they need it. The truth is, two kinds of organizations come to us quite readily and frequently. That is very small organizations like nonprofits internationally that are realizing that they want this data, and they're doing things in such a careful way that they realize that they don't want the data risk for themselves or the individuals. And enormous multinationals who have a privacy person or staff and a diversity person or staff. And I sort of envision them meeting in the hall and saying, I need the data. You can't have the data. And once that happens, very often it's privacy who reaches out to me. Sometimes it's diversity and inclusion. And it is really our staff has fielded a lot of inquiries from organizations of those two types. It's the middle organizations where they feel that the trains are running on time and they have both programs, but they haven't quite hit that realization that maybe they shouldn't be taking on as much data as they are, or they want to take it on in a region, right, in the EU or the EEA, where they can't do it easily, readily, or in a way that's welcome to the staff or students.
There's a difference between privacy, confidentiality, secrecy, privilege, so those things aren't, I feel like people get those things confused about, especially as it relates to kind of privacy and regulation. And then this categorization of data, which is happening more and more, especially in the US with the states, it just gets very confusing. So like I have to spend like quite a bit of time telling people, okay, that's not that's not sensitive data. That's not, it may be personal data. It may be something you may not want other people to see, but it doesn't have that protection of kind of law or regulation.
This brings us back to something that you and I had actually spoken about another time as well, which is, where do we start the education around this, right? How early can we start to talk to students in schools about their privacy, about engaging with the digital world for various reasons, certainly about their privacy, and then making sure that through the schools that citizens have the education around their rights and their concerns and their considerations, and where we can have this common language, we are empowered to do so. Because, and I know that you've raised the metaverse before, right? So the notion is, as all of this, the internet, people, the kids call it I don't know. I think people my age call it the interwebs, right? So that this universe that has become a part of our lives, right? That if whether it's the brand Meta or the metaverse itself, and in so many iterations, as this becomes a richer, more clearly defined universe in which people are spending huge amounts of time, energy, and data, I think we really have to start teaching not just our colleagues and the businesses that we help, but I think we have to push down and start doing some pretty mass education. Don't you think?
Oh yeah. I mean, I don't know, I guess parallel to cyber in that way. I feel like education needs to be continual and ongoing, but then also people need to understand what their rights are. And I think that's how I became interested in privacy. So my mother was reading a book in 1997 called The Right to Privacy. And she was fascinated by this concept, and her interest piqued my interest. So I read the book and I was shocked. I think in the US, we think, okay, we're so free, we're land of the, home of the brave, land of the free, happiness and all this other type of stuff, liberty, life, liberty, happiness. And, once I realized that privacy wasn't like a fundamental right, or it wasn't expressed in, detailed terms, I'm like, what? Because you think, to me, privacy is like freedom, so it's like, what? Like, that's not private? Or, what rights do I have? So that really sparked my interest in privacy, and, still does, because I see articles and I'm like, what? what happened? What did this company do with data? It just shocks me, from a day-to-day basis. What are your thoughts?
Well, it's funny because there are so many books like that. I don't know if you know, but the Future of Privacy Forum has a really good book club that actually has a lot of great books that I've continued to push myself with and to think alongside scholars in our field. So that made me happy to think of you coming at it that way, which I think is a very honest way to come by it. I think what's most interesting to me about the notion of the right to privacy is that it's something that it's probably the only right, with the exception of joining the military, the only right that we so quickly barter away, right? So people, well, yeah, you can have my data if I can, do this thing that I want to do and not pay. So you can't think of that many other things whereby you give away your rights, right? Like even you go to your job, you give away your time and you follow their rules, but your rights remain in place. But privacy is something where we've, because of the speed with which all of the technology has grown up around us, and the shiny objects that we wish to see or share or touch or somehow interact with, the sort of theft of privacy by virtue of even where you have some transparency is something that people are willing to let go of. So it's interesting. I guess I'm sorry, I'm being a bit circular here. You were surprised and engaged at the notion of the sort of the delta in whether we should have a right to privacy in the way that the US law covers it. And what I think is interesting there is, and this is Daniel Silov, right? He writes about the privacy paradox brilliantly. People don't know that they care, right? So yes, okay, great. I should have all the rights that I want. But why do I want them? Is it because I can bargain it away for this other thing? Or should I look at it from a bigger picture and understand both what I want to be the case for everyone, a standard, and what I'm willing to disclose? And it's a very, very interesting thing. So what do you actually think about that bartering and the value people place on their privacy? Is there a way that we can work to not just educate people on it, but improve that? How do we show the return on investment for individuals to hold their information close when their banks are being breached every third day? So they're always getting notifications that their information is exposed. How do you tell them it's still important?
Wow, that's a great question. I don't know. I feel like, especially marketers or even cyber criminals. I wouldn't say marketers are cyber criminals, but people who want information, people who want data about you, and they can, they're smart at being able to get that information. A lot of it goes to, how can I give this person immediate gratification in exchange for them to give me something that they don't know today that is going to be valuable in the future. So yeah, I think, because you work with a lot of people, in Europe, and this is always a sticking point between kind of the US and Europe and our conception about privacy, where for them, privacy is kind of an innate fundamental human right. So it's a cradle to grave
That's
right
right.
of an individual, where here is like, sometimes you have it, sometimes you don't, depending on what you're doing or what data that you're using, privacy may kick in. And it's, in a way, it's in the US, it's tied to consuming. So because privacy regulation is tied to the consumption of something, when you're not consuming, what privacy rights do you have? Or, people may feel like, okay, well, I will give someone my fingerprints for a $10 coupon on the thing that I want to buy today. So it's like, let me satisfy my immediate, gratification for a future harm that is unseen. I think that's what it is.
I agree. I also think that the tether to consumers on the strongest law we have, right, the CCPA, was intentional. And I think it came from, or it came about organically, but at the same time, the reason I think it took purchase was because of that tying into the economy, right? Whereas things get very political when you talk about human rights in the US and you talk about the human right to privacy. So I'm hoping that as we see this proliferation of state laws, you're noticing that it's not everywhere, right? It is really CCPA that has focused that direction. California always being admirably very different and its own. And CCPA, people used to complain, they say, oh, is GDPR really the gold standard? And personally, I think yes, like I think that was forged in fire, but and there was a lot of hard work that went in there. But is CCPA the best thing that we could do? I think that the work that has been done, CCPA has grown the US up overall, right? Because you don't know who owns property in California just because they work for you. We have been moved ahead by virtue of this. But I'm still seeing, you're seeing these other draft laws that are coming into place. They're not running alongside the consumer aspect. So hopefully that's an anomaly, but I do agree. You're right. We're taking information that will be vulnerable for a lot longer than the individual imagines and used to catch them, even if it's as a consumer, in a lot of other ways. Now, I will say, as a lot of good people at Meta, and there are a lot of great privacy people at Meta now, will tell you individuals like to have personalized marketing, right? So there is that sort of, it's almost its own philosophy class at this point. I think you could get a pretty good philosophy class going in the full arc of human existence within the internet and the way we engage with the world. What should you, in theory, want in terms of privacy? What do you as an individual like that you get out of sacrificing your privacy? And how can we in this industry help direct you toward a balancing test that lets you flag and raise your hand and say, yes, but not this, or yes, this, but only for these purposes? I do think that there's sort of more research and consideration that can go in there as we move further into these more complex systems.
Right. Let's talk about the states. So I think you're a great person to talk about the U.S. states and kind of what's happening on the state level in the U.S. With privacy regulation. So, to me, the U.S. patchwork of laws is probably the most complicated of any country I could think of, because it changes so fast. So these states can pass these laws pretty fast, faster than we could do something on the federal level. And a lot of these laws are different enough to be annoying, right? So they're trying to address the same issue, but doing it in different ways, almost bespoke, right? So I think that some states had envy of the CCPA in California because they're like, okay, California is getting all this attention, internationally. So let me do some law and do something a little bit different in California to make me stand out. And, to me, that's what we don't want. Like, we want more conformity, more consensus on just, I would be happy if we even had just a standard nationally about what is personal data, what is sensitive data. That would help tremendously, not only in kind of the privacy regulation, but also kind of data breach as well. So we're seeing kind of confusion there. But I just want to toss this out here and let you give me your thoughts on this. So as I think about what's happening in the US with the states, what I'm seeing is that two things that the states seem to be doing that is similar enough. So one is they are moving us from a notice regime where all companies have to do is say, hey, I'm taking your data, I'm going to do X, Y, and Z, and you get a pamphlet in the mail or you just get an email. And they're creating these consent mechanisms or consent requirements for certain types of data. So that's something that we didn't have. And I see that in the state laws. And then the other thing is this categorization of, almost like New York, like the tiers of data, and certain data has certain additional, requirements or certain additional fines based on kind of the misuse or abuse of that information. So what are your thoughts about what it is that the states are doing, together that's kind of moving privacy forward in the US?
So it's a really great question. And I have to say, all I could think when you began and we're talking about consent is again the parallel with GDPR and with Europe and how you're viewing and coming to things. So consent in the US, for me, what is very clear, right, is that we are a very contract-based universe. And so the way we come about consent is not so much privacy is your default right. And if you are to relinquish any aspect of it, you must yourself make an active choice. It is more, okay, we know people don't read those notices, they don't read their email. So we at least need to get them to say that they have, and then it's back on them, right? So I don't think that the changes are coming from the same place that those same results, right, are born of out of the European platform and standards. But I do think that they are helpful in that this two-sided aspect of saying companies have to tell you, but you have to be paying attention. Whereas, again, with the UK and cookies, they're not wrong. There's a point where people just get fatigued and they're just going to consent. So that is also an issue. And that, sorry to come back to it, but with the transparency, you and I had talked another time about sort of, is there a way we could do things in a very simple way with symbols or something, whereby you sort of the way that you do with food at a restaurant now, you say, oh, that's gluten-free. I know that symbol, right? You say, oh, they're going to use this for biometric data. I know that symbol. I'll opt out. Is there a way to make it more shorthand is my question, because it's got to be more efficient. The contract aspect of people actually consenting in the US, I think, was an inevitability, because otherwise there's sort of no way to prove that the information was effectively exchanged and registered, and even the proof there is limited. In terms of the other piece, the different tiers of information, I agree with you that there needs to be standard language. It is funny to think too. So when I was a kid and I was thinking, oh, well, I'm going to go to law school someday, because for whatever reason, I had it in my head from a very young age. And the party of the first part, right, there was this very elaborate formal language that kept the law at a remove, even more so than just basic convoluted terminology, kept the law even more at a remove from individuals than it is now. Like now we're in a legal design phase where people are starting to understand that just like privacy related issues, transparency, clarity, and an intentionally simplified agreement is actually a very valuable thing in this world. And I guess all I'm saying is, where the states are entangling their own language and their own priorities and new bills to sort of carve out little pieces that are stamped with that state's imprimatur, like that's not actually helpful for the individuals. And the only benefit that I see is that it yet again removes the law from the individual in such a way that, say, privacy professionals like yourself and I can find ways to help elucidate that, right? So this is not a good move, moving toward more tricky laws and standards, even as you talk about data breach, right? If you have a data breach, your notification requirements, like I don't know about everybody else, but I mean, I have a huge spreadsheet with that I had to make up that sort of lets us know what happens where for any organization in case of, and who do you notify? And it's never the same. So at that point, we've created inefficiency and inconsistency and hoops to jump through. And I'm not sure it's serving anyone.
Yeah, I agree with that. It's so confusing. And then the thing that just really gets on my last nerve, tap dances on my nerves, is when a state has a law. So let's say they passed a data breach law a couple years ago, and instead of passing a new law, about privacy, they'll just update that old law. So on the books, it looks the same, right? Like, it
Mm.
has the same number and everything, but the text has changed somewhere, or they're trying to tag something else on. And I think it just creates just that much more confusion about trying to follow, because you think, okay, well, like you have your spreadsheet. Okay, I have all the states and I know all the, the references and all this stuff. And then they go in and say, okay, well, we're going to add, this new language to this old law. So now you have to go back to that old law and try to update what those changes are.
This is a problem in government contracting too, right? Like it's just you get a mod change, but it's the same thing and not calling that. I will say the California legislation handled that incredibly well as they were making changes to CCPA and to CPR. Like those aspects are being very well done in other places. And I think you've made a very sound point there, right? Where we're looking at whether we're calling it that or not, where we're looking at transparency for consumers. Let's look at clarity and transparency in changes around these laws as they do get updated to accommodate new considerations and concerns like COVID, right? This is important to be able to highlight, leave a track changes somewhere in the wings so that people who are working so hard to stay abreast of an entire tapestry of laws across the country can do so most effectively for the people that they serve. I think that's a great point.
Yeah, I agree. So let's talk a little bit about transparency. So I guess there is a tension here, and I'm sure you run into this a lot when you're working with organizations. So we're preaching to people that they need to be transparent with their customers or the people that they have data about regarding what you do with your data. But then we're also saying you need to keep the information private, right? Or, you know what I mean? Protect the privacy of individuals. So how do you reconcile with people, or how do you explain kind of the difference or their obligation about, how to be transparent, but also how to protect data and keep it private when you're handling it?
Well, and it's rare that a company doesn't have some understanding of it, but I think it's an interesting alignment there is so the transparency part, I'm really emphatic about what you would want to like what you would expect someone to do with your information, right? So and sort of what you would expect to be told based on reading something. So if you come to our site or any sort of a site and it says we're going to take your information and we're going to use it just while you're on the site and then we're going to get rid of it, then you would expect that 2 days later, if they had a data breach, they would not have your information, right? You're going to expect that these termination and the conditions of what they're taking and how they're using it and how long they're keeping it, that those will be clear. And I think that really, if it's transparency, then if you're going to do grocery shopping, for instance, online, then I think much like you said, why do people make changes and not call them out to me? If I'm grocery shopping online, I am not necessarily expecting that this is going to communicate with Facebook about products that Meta or any other organization. I wasn't trying to call someone out, but that this is going to communicate elsewhere what I'm doing, right? Maybe they're going to keep my data, but I think that transparency is making sure people have a clear delineation of anything they wouldn't expect and the ability to opt out or opt in. So if it's not something that you would actually, as a user, normally expect, I don't think you're being transparent unless you have conspicuously called it out, because that is what we should be doing, right? The lowest common denominator is not a person who doesn't understand anything. It might be a 17-year-old or a 76-year-old who's just not as familiar. And you have to go down to the base. For me, transparency is about trying to really work from a design thinking standpoint to anticipate the language that's needed to make clear the things that would not be intuitively understood or anticipated, to make them very clear. The keeping things private, right? I think it's actually a really cool alignment to say, we want to be transparent with you, but we are going to make sure that nothing about you is there's no transparency there to the rest of the world or to any systems outside those that you've acquiesced to be tied to. So maybe that's where they meet up.
Maybe we need a reasonable persons test. and
Always.
privacy.
Mm-hmm.
What is reasonable? So if you go and buy a gallon of milk at a grocery store, does this obligate you to, name your first child after the grocery store? I'm just coming up with kind of crazy stuff, right? Because we know a lot of times that these agreements between the consumer and the company that wants to collect their data is naturally asymmetrical, but is extremely asymmetrical in a situation where maybe the company is collecting the data is collecting way more than they should, don't have really a good reason. So I'll give you an example. There was a company many years ago, they had an app that it would take your face and it would age you, make you look older or something like that. And I was like, the new thing. But if you read their policy, like terms of service, what they were doing, they basically said, if you use our app, you give us kind of the worldwide,
License for
authority license forever for your image. So, you use the app for 5 minutes and your picture can be on a billboard in Tokyo in 10 years. That doesn't seem like an even exchange.
No, I think that's right. And that's different. So then there's the reasonable person test to how to determine what is needed for transparency. And then, well, what do you do with a reasonable person test in a country that will allow us to contract for almost anything, right? So if you have the transparency, then a reasonable person might very well still, I don't know if it's a reasonable person, but someone who prioritizes, whether they're reasonable or not, someone who doesn't prioritize that ownership of visual data or that ownership of that would have a hard time. I think that's a really interesting question and suggestion. I don't think we can say, because there are so many curious things. I think a great example is personalized marketing for the people who like it, right? Then the more sources it pulls from, the more refined it is. And then they go, and whether or not they're buying, they can, sort of enjoy a world that's tailored to them. And that's a real thing that needs a lot of data to feed it. And for the people who want it, really benefits them. So the reasonable person test, I think, has to be about, what would you do? I guess that's my question, is where we think something is unreasonable. Yes, we agree that we would have to highlight it from a transparency standpoint and say, are you sure that you understand this? But then should the law in some way say, should we be talking about fitness for purpose? Oh, that's a weird way to use that term, but fitness for purpose of the data collected, like the appropriateness. And I wonder, because I don't think we're going to get any traction to try to restrict the way that people can allow their data to be used. So I'm curious, if you're talking about a reasonable person, how would we apply it?
That's a good question. Yeah, because some people may agree to things that we may think is unreasonable. But I
Right.
don't know. To me, I think, and it may be different culturally, depending on where people are and what their experiences are. But I think, to me, I wish there was, and there isn't right now. I wish there was a ceiling to how asymmetrical a relationship could be in terms of a consumer giving their data to another person. So I don't think that using an app for 5 minutes and the exchange will be that I would give them my image forever, the rights to use my image forever.
That's maybe the cleanest way to do it, now that you mention it. So the problem is it would be very hard to enforce, both, especially with secondary processors, right? Subprocessors and various things. But if people just had a choice to say, you can keep my data for a day, a year, or a decade. If they could control that, right? And they say, like, anything tied to this application that I give you permission for, all follow-on information, you are allowed to have this for this amount of time. You're not wrong in that time would be a very valuable control, especially where the details and the information weren't. But then of course, we'd have to have somebody who would actually follow behind and enforce and audit that, which is going to be your big problem. And then the legislation really has to cash in. So maybe if we're clamoring for legislation to do one thing, maybe it's a proportionate test, right, around the retention of data that does tie into a certain level of consent. Sort of, I want you to keep my data for a minimum amount of time, right? Like a big picture cookies, right? Like you can only use the sort of what you need to function on the site, or you can keep it for a longer but still reasonable time. And then maybe legislation can speak to what is reasonable. Just a thought.
That's brilliant. I think we're gonna have to talk about
There's
this.
our collaboration.
Yeah. Because as you know, that's where the collection and retention of data, that's where companies get in trouble. So if you're not collecting or you're not retaining, you literally have very little, you lower your risk considerably. But people are like, digital pack rats want to keep everything, businesses especially. So being able to kind of limit that retention and maybe put a cap on it, like you said. So right now it's like, how long does the data tie to the purpose that you're needing it for? And I think that's harder for organizations because it means that they have to continually, create these triggers for themselves internally for when that happens. When you say, okay, this type of data gets deleted every 6 months or every month or every year or every 3 years, maybe that would be an easier way for people to comply.
Well, and the great part, though, about privacy by design and privacy engineering and GDPR, frankly, the imprint that it's had, is that we do understand that there have to be data lanes from which you can withdraw somebody completely. So it's not that hard to imagine. I mean, I realize that we're doing sort of like our own ad hoc philosophy class here, but it's not that hard to imagine that a person could say, I opt in for minimum retention, or I opt in for 6-year or, indefinite retention, whatever they choose. And then their data would follow through all of the stops that it's going to make, but on that lane. So it could be withdrawn just as it would for a data subject access request. I mean, it's not likely, but it's certainly technically feasible and very, very interesting, because when the notices and the consent, right? But the consent is premised upon a notice that says we keep your data for 6 years. They get no choices.
That's true. Wow. Well, I think we hit on something here. We may have to expand upon this at a later date. That's so cool.
We're going to get pinged. We're going to find out that we didn't invent the wheel in this, and that someone has already got a huge dissertation. To whoever it is that has already been working on this for 10 years, I personally want to apologize for trying to chase down this path without your knowledge alongside us.
Oh my goodness. Well, we're going to find that out. We're going to find out whoever it is. We need to contact them.
The gauntlet is thrown.
Right. Throw them a glove down. So if it were the world according to Shoshana, and we did everything that you said, what would be your wish for privacy anywhere in the world, whether it be technology, human stuff, regulation?
So you opened up two things. So I have to go with consistency and clarity, a universal standard with universal terms and understandings of basic concepts that are taught and understood wherever the internet may roam, would be the first one. And then I have to say it, you touched on something else pretty critical. I don't know if I'm sure you've heard of David Ryan-Polger's The All Tech is Human, right? Is the notion that in parallel to that accessibility of information about privacy to individuals and the clarity there, is the responsibility for the builders of these systems and these apps and these tools that we use and the organizations who are building them, the responsibility to align with and support both the individuals themselves and their privacy, and their ability to exercise their rights. So some sort of nice meeting of the mind there.
Wow.
Complicated dream.
You've thought about this question, so that's great. That's great. Well, thank you so much. This is so fun for us.
Oh, Debbie, thank you so much. It's great to see you.
Yeah, this is great. So we definitely have to collaborate and figure out what we want to do for the new year. And yeah, so this is amazing. And I'm glad that you were able to do it. We'll chat soon for sure.
Of course, take good care, and thank you again for your time. It's always wonderful to hear you and to be pushed ahead by the thoughts and the questions you're asking. Have a gorgeous day.
You too. Bye-bye.